Welcome to the Three Brothers Quest, where we seek mystery and meaning in our living cosmos. I'm Dr. Rob Williams, your host. Our special guest today, all the way across the pond, is Anne Baring. Anne, welcome.
Lovely to be here, Rob. See you again.
We are so happy to have you. And yes, this is our second conversation. And before we go any further, I'd refer our listeners, our viewers, to your website, annebaring.com. You have a brand new book, Messages from a Transcendent Dimension. And your classic, I don't know if that's the right word, but I think of it as classic book, Dream of the Cosmos, which we spoke about in depth in our first conversation, and you presented us with a beautiful and very provocative set of slides as part of that conversation. And we'll refer our listeners and viewers to a link to that conversation here in the show notes. Welcome back.
Okay, let's go.
Let's go. So we wanted to focus on this fairly popular article that you wrote called Our Crucial Time of Choice that has been making the rounds certainly amongst the brothers and in our Marian Institute community, and certainly on the wider web. Let's set the stage, Anne, and if you would begin with explaining to us what you mean by the divine feminine.
Well, basically, it's the missing or forgotten feminine aspect of God or deity, whatever we want to call it. It's been missing for 2,500 years, and I'm doing my best to restore it because we're so unbalanced as a culture that we really need the divine feminine to balance the divine masculine, which has been our kind of model for 2,500 years, not only in Christianity, but in Judaism as well. So it's time for a change in the archetypal image. And we need the marriage, we need the sacred marriage of the two principles if we're to restore our culture to balance. At the moment, it's very unbalanced. And to bring it back, as it were, to center, we need the male and the female principles in a sacred marriage as the ground of everything that we are and everything that we're trying to learn about as inhabitants of this planet.
And you point to a specific historical moment and a group called the Deuteronomists. Can you remind us of the importance of this moment and who they were?
Yes, I can. It was exactly 623 BCE that they took over the first temple in Jerusalem. They got rid of the high priest, who'd been a sort of in the shamanic tradition of communing with the Queen of Heaven. And they got rid of the goddess, whose name was Asherah, who had been the wife of Yahweh until that moment. So they had the sacred marriage until 623 BC. But in that time, they ditched the goddess. They got rid of every scrap of evidence that she ever existed. They even changed words in the Old Testament to really make her appear as something completely different from what she was. She represented divine wisdom and the Holy Spirit and the tree of life, those three things. And they got rid of the divine wisdom and the Holy Spirit, and they put two trees of life in the Garden of Eden, two trees rather, when they created the myth of the fall, because that was the second thing they did. The first thing was to get rid of the goddess. All trace of her went. The second thing was to create the myth of the fall and to give Eve, the wife of Adam, to give Eve the title of the great mother, really, mother of all living. That was the title of the previous goddess. And that was the title, really, of all the goddesses right the way back to the Neolithic, if you like. The Great Mother was the principle that was carried forward as the goddesses of the Bronze Age, and then later in the time that I'm speaking of. And so with that went the contact with nature, because the goddess had always represented the life of the planet, really, all the life of the universe. And she was the great womb of the universe from which all life came forth. Then suddenly now, with the Deuteronomists, we had one single male God, monotheistic God, up in heaven, creating the world as something separate from himself, completely separate. So this was an enormous cultural and psychological change. because you no longer had the close relationship with nature. You no longer had the natural world coming forth from the divine feminine. You only had the divine masculine creating nature and creating the world as something separate from himself, something that he wasn't intrinsically part of, whereas the goddess was part of it. She was it. Do you see what I mean?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. And
So
you
that
write,
was a huge change. And I did, in the talk I gave a couple of weeks ago, I gave a demonstration of that as an umbilical cord with a sword cutting it, and the hand holding the sword cutting it. And that divided everything into spirit up above and nature down below. And you had dualism coming in, and you had the, what's the word? Polarization. That was the beginning of polarization, because you had the above and the below not in harmony with each other, but in almost antagonistic relationship to each other. They weren't as one. And that's been the whole work of alchemy, and indeed the Egyptian priesthood was to restore the oneness that once existed, to connect the above and the below. That's the great work of alchemy, was to connect the above and below that had been split apart in 623 BCE.
that image you just referenced of the sword cutting the umbilical cord. I listened to that talk you just referenced, and it was so resonant and powerful and disturbing um, for me. It really helped me understand the importance of what you're speaking about. You write here, the replacement of the Great Mother by the Great Father 4 millennia ago initiated the process of our separation from nature. Is dualism, we've split into.
It was coming, it began around 2000 BCE and then progressed through the Babylonian Empire and other sort of other time things that were happening at that time, until it got to this moment in 623, which was the kind of cut-off point. But there was a long process leading up to that. Before that, you had the goddesses and the gods together in Sumerian culture, in Babylonian culture, in Greek culture. And then all of a sudden you have the Great Father, and all the goddesses and gods disappear. So that's a huge change, because they represented aspects of human nature and aspects of life which were important to include. And now suddenly you had this very imperious Father God who said, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," and who really, well, there are passages in the book of Deuteronomy which are horrendous, really, in which he tells the people to go and kill anybody who disagrees with him, to get rid of the pagan gods, etc., etc. So that was an enormous change, specifically at that time. And then that led into the Babylonian destruction of the first temple, and the Babylonian captivity, which came about 100 years after that. I can't remember the exact dates, but quite shortly afterwards. But what you had, which was so extraordinary, and I'd like to put this in, a lot of the Jews were furious with what had happened with the temple. They loved the old kind of structure that had existed, and they left Jerusalem and moved to Alexandria. And then a second lot moved after the Babylonian captivity, and a third lot moved after the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. So you had 3 lots of Jewish people moving away from Jerusalem to Alexandria. And they took with them the whole cult of the goddess and the memory of the kind of beliefs and structures and worship thing that they had. They took with them. And that eventually, I think, came into the creation of Kabbalah, because I think that Kabbalah was the actual teaching of the first temple, obviously modified a lot on over 1,000 years or even 2,000, but still the same essential teaching. And in Kabbalah, you have the union of the male and female aspects of the Godhead still in the sacred marriage. It's the only, as I said in my last talk with you and your brothers, that is the only cosmology that kept the union of the 2 archetypal principles.
Yes, and I remember that well, Anne. I heard you in your talk recently mention the importance of John Lash's work, particularly his
Yeah,
Not in His Image, which is his fairly comprehensive um, research around the Gnostics.
yes.
Can you? I was so curious to hear your take on that book. I just recently reread it.
Well, I think it's one of the most interesting books I've ever read, and I'm struggling with it. I'm struggling with the chapter on the Gnostics in my new book, which I hope to publish next year, because they're so important. And Lash was the only person really who went into why they were so important, and also how widespread their teaching was, what extraordinary teachers they were in the Roman Empire, how, particularly in Alexandria, but also in other places all over the empire, they were the real teachers and the transmitters of education to the people over a very long time, going back probably at least 600 years to the pre-Socratic philosophers and to the early mysteries of Greece, all tied up together. And he explains it wonderfully, really, but also very complex, extremely complex. So that I'm reading other books on the Gnostics. I'm reading the Nag Hammadi texts, which are the ones that were found in Egypt in 1945
Yes.
and were published in 1977, and which are fascinating to read because they give a different atmosphere of what Christianity was like. I'm also reading channeled materials on the Essenes and on Mary Magdalene, which are again extremely interesting, which I'm putting into my book because I don't think they should be excluded.
Mm.
So between Lash and these other ones, I'm struggling a bit with my one chapter, which was supposed to be not more than 15 pages, but it's going to be more like 30,
Yes,
because
and
the Gnostics are so important. And they tie in with the Essenes, who were the people who really created a protective, what you call it, net around Yeshua, so that he could do his work, carry out his mission, only 3 years of mission. And they kind of protected him and provided him with safe communities to move from one to the other so that he could do his teaching without being molested and interfered with. And it's absolutely fascinating. And they write so wonderfully about the meaning of light. The word light was extremely important both to the Gnostics and the Essenes, and light as the ground of all that is. And this will take us back at the end of this interview with the quantum physics physicists.
yes, yes, yes. But I want to hear a bit about your new project. But just the thing, Lash is funny because he's very contrarian, as you know,
Yeah,
and he's arguing with all these other Gnostic scholars about kind of the true meaning, if you will, or the best way to approach the history of Gnosticism. And for example, I first ran across the Gnostics with Elaine Pagels and her classic work,
yes,
Gnostic Gospels, which he basically dismisses and says, good try, Elaine, but you're missing so much of the depth and the
yeah.
resonance. Yes,
Well,
fascinating.
I think he's had time to go into it. Elaine Pedrels came right after the publication of
Yes.
Nag Hammadi text, and in fact, she has a chapter in that herself. But she couldn't have known all that he's been able to discover, and what Hypatia, for instance, was teaching in Alexandria in the great school there. What was it that her audience was listening to? That sort of thing. So
Can you say
he brings it to life.
yes? Can you say a word about Hypatia? Because Lash opens his book with her. I'd never heard of her before, and that story of what happens to her is so illustrative. I think
Well, it is a horrific story,
it
but she
is.
was teaching really in the around the 410 CE in the great library of Alexandria, which was a fantastic place, and Lash describes it wonderfully, with an immense center of scholarship and creativity, and also the courses they gave, everything from philosophy and mathematics down to technical things of how to create things from wood or whatever. I mean, they had all the basic skills of humanity in the teaching there, as well as the intellectual skills, which was so fascinating because they included the whole range of human gifts in the different courses that they gave there. Anyway, she was teaching philosophy and mathematics, And there was a group of fanatical Christians, unfortunately, because by then Christianity had lost the teaching of Jesus and had become really a church that was determined to impose its will and its order, as it were, on the rest of Western humanity. And it didn't take kindly to the Gnostics. It wanted to get rid of them as much as possible. And anyway, a mob was organized in Alexandria, which attacked Hypatia as she was driving home in her chariot. She always drove her own chariot. And I can't go into the details because they're too horrible, but they pulled her down from that and they killed her. And then they really just removed every scrap of flesh from her bones and just left her a skeleton. A most revolting, excruciatingly awful story. And then were very pleased with themselves and went to the bishop and said, "Oh, look what we've done. We've killed Hypatia." And of course, he was pleased because he didn't want, she was a great Gnostic teacher, and he didn't want that going on in Alexandria. He wanted to replace it with Christian teaching. So it was a huge, people have called it the beginning of the Dark Ages. And I think it was, because it really closed off the whole Gnostic visionary tradition and experiential tradition, because they not only knew about it, but they had experienced whatever it was they were talking about this divine light that was at the root of everything. They had visionary experience of it. They were probably clairaudient and visionaries, really, so that they could see more than most people and hear more than most people. But anyway, that was the end, really. And after that, the great library, I think, was destroyed. Nobody knows exactly who did it or when it was done, but thousands and thousands of wonderful, wonderful texts were destroyed, just as they were in Herculaneum by the eruption of Vesuvius. So those two great libraries were destroyed. But Lash says that there were libraries all over the Mediterranean. Wherever there were temples, there were libraries. So there are probably more libraries hidden,
Yes.
waiting for archaeologists to dig them out from under the ruins of these temples. And he says, in fact, that the Nag Hammadi, he thinks that the texts that were buried at Nag Hammadi actually had come from the temple of Dendera, which was just across the river, and that possibly a group of Gnostics had taken shelter there, but that a local man who had the same idea as Cyril of Alexandria wanted to get rid of the Gnostics. And so they got word that they were going to be hunted down. And so they quickly buried these texts in the red clay jar in which this peasant found them in 1945. But they buried them hurriedly, obviously, in just one jar. And miraculously, but it's quite possible that that temple was a place which was a teaching place, even then in I think it was 330 AD or something like that, in the middle of the 4th century. That was probably a teaching place where Gnostics could live and teach and write these texts and things. So it's all a fascinating story, and he brings out aspects of it that I hadn't known at all before through the other books on Gnostics that I'd read.
Can I ask you a little bit about your new project? Or
Well, my new project is a book, my final book, because I'm 92 now, and I don't expect I'll be around till I'm 100. So it's called Divine Wisdom and the Holy Spirit, the lost aspect of the feminine, of the divine feminine, the lost aspect of the divine feminine, something like that. I haven't really finalized it, but it's the history of how the divine feminine was lost in more detail than I did in the Dream of the Cosmos. And it goes into the history again, which I had done already in the Dream of the Cosmos, but in a slightly different way. But then I'm bringing in other chapters like Cinderella, which is the story of the godmother, rescuing the human soul from the ashes in which she's been condemned by the stepmother, who is the church. So if you just read through, as you can do with the help of a wonderful man called Bailey, so there's a chapter on Cinderella, there's a chapter on Esclarmonde de Foix, who was the great teacher of the Cathars, because the Cathars took forward the Gnostic teaching of Mary Magdalene and Jesus in the 12th century in France, and established a church there called the Church of the Holy Spirit, which was the same name as the goddess of the trashed by the Deuteronomist. So that is, it all connects in a long line of sort of forgotten connections, and Kabbalah comes into it. There's a chapter on Kabbalah, a chapter on the mystic texts of the Old Testament, like the book of Proverbs and the Apocalypse. Wonderful text there called the Book of Ben Sirah and the Book of the Wisdom of Solomon are in the Apocrypha, and the lovely story of Tobias and the angel Raphael. Do you know that story? It's my favorite story. So those are all going to be brought in to show how important they were as showing the connection between this world and the transcendent world. Because in those days, people were in connection with angels and archangels. They spoke to them and they had answers from them. They weren't far away. And all that was wiped out by the Deuteronomists. They got rid of the angels, the angelic hosts. They just got rid of them altogether. So we don't hear about them anymore. And that was a terrible loss. They came back in Christianity because you had the 4 archangels there. But even so, in modern Christianity, you never hear about angels and archangels. So we've lost that connection.
And you're going to bring it back. It's so. So I grew up in the Christian church, Anne, and I remember every Sunday. I sang in the choir. I was an altar boy. The Episcopal Church, which is a runt of the Catholics, I suppose. But and I remember every Sunday hearing about the angels and the archangels and all the company of heaven.
Yeah, all the company of heaven. It's such a wonderful phrase.
Isn't that a great phrase? And I always, as a kid, I was like, where are these? Where are these people? Or where are these creatures? But I was so taken, with the ritual and the liturgy, and there's something very powerful about being in a sacred space like that. And yet, as you and others have pointed out, we're missing an important half of the story, which is the divine feminine. And yet there is this thread, as you say, that runs through spiritual history, let's say, that is still with us. And it's so you write here in your article, a new vision is struggling to be born, a new vision of our profound relationship with an intelligent, living, and interconnected universe.
Yeah. That's absolutely right, because we've been disconnected through materialist science. That's another thing, which the Gnostics would have called the work of the archons, taking us away from our true path. I'm going to put a lot about the archons as well, because we've lost our path so often through malefic influences, which have said that they were beneficent, but were not. The way the Christian church developed was supposed to be good, but it wasn't, because it immediately went into attacking the pagan culture and destroying everything that it could. That was not the way that Jesus would have thought they would behave. It was not exactly what would have been planned for. So this has happened again and again, and with always slaughter, destruction, and wiping out of what went before. So I'm bringing back all these fragments that have been lost on the way and trying to put them into a coherent picture and show that the divine feminine was absolutely essential to our understanding of life from the Paleolithic onwards until the middle of the Bronze Age. And then it began to be distorted by the priesthoods who developed in the different religious traditions of different empires. And they took over more and more until finally you had the Deuteronomists taking over in the Judaic tradition and wiping out the past, wiping out the hosts of heaven, wiping out. They even took away the instruments that they watched the stars through at that time. I don't know what they were exactly, but they had on the roof of the temple, they had a kind of observatory in which they could connect with the stars and speak to them, like people actually are speaking today to stars like Sirius and Arcturus and different star centers, which the majority of people don't know about, but I get this information coming in and say, would you like to join this or that webinar? So I know what's going on in that field, as it were. And it's fascinating that it's coming back, this connection with the hosts of heaven. So that's all lovely, really. But it's very difficult work to do this because it has to be accurate historically. All dates and things like that have to be worked on. And also the different people who destroyed the thing, like Theodosius I, at the end of the 4th century, he put out an edict that anybody who didn't agree with the texts of what was put out in 325 in the creed, the Christian creed, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, would be declared a heretic. So he introduced the idea of heresy into the church, and from then on it grew and grew and grew until you had the Inquisition later on.
Theodosius, he was Roman emperor, correct?
He was a Roman emperor, very important one, yeah, after Constantine.
Yes, it's interesting because most people, I think, are under the impression that Constantine made official Christianity as the official
He
religion of
did,
the empire, and then, but in some ways, the more important moment is the one you just described, where heresy is in
yes.
to
The
kind of,
idea there has to be only one way, only one creed, and there's no feminine in that creed. 3 Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all male, and the Holy Spirit should have been the feminine, but wasn't there because it had been ditched by the Deuteronomists, and Christianity took over Judaism, the Old Testament, as it was, so to speak, without questioning and without knowing what had happened, because they had no idea of knowing then, had no internet.
right. So the divine feminine really, there's this concerted historical and religious attempt to stamp it out, and it
Deliberate, yeah,
yes, and you're
absolutely deliberate, so that she would never appear in the Godhead again. That was it. That was finished, done with. That was over. So they wiped out the whole history, prehistory really, of what had happened in the Paleolithic and the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. And also they wiped out all the role of women in the temples, because there were no temples dedicated to the goddess where the women could serve, and where midwifery could be developed, all that kind of thing, healing with herbs and all that kind of thing would have gone with the temple where the women worked and served the goddess. So a huge amount of everything went, possibly methods of healing. There was a coarseness that entered in, a sort of ferocious power-seeking drive, really, to hold the whole stage for the male god, for the male father god.
I was going to say, you would equate this with the archetypal masculine, I suppose.
Taking over, yes.
Yes, yes. It's so interesting because in our conversations here with some other guests who I'm sure you know, Mark Booth, Graham Hancock,
Graham Hancock, I know, definitely. I think great admirer of him.
yes, and Gary Lockman, who looks at the secret history, he calls, of the Western world. Women were so prominent and central in the so-called mystery schools.
Yeah,
And
they were. And they were teachers and priestesses right the way through, including in Alexandria with Hypatia. They were renowned teachers, and there were many others probably we don't know about at all.
yes, so to bring back the feminine and women to a prominent place.
You've got frozen. No, it's okay now.
Oh, okay. Yeah. To bring back women and the feminine seems to be maybe the most important task of our moment. I wanted to ask you about quantum physics for a moment, because you write here in your article so beautifully, you call quantum physics the new story emerging, tells us that the whole universe is a unified field. Our lives are part of a cosmic web of life. We are part of an immense field of consciousness, which sustains not only our world, but also the entire universe. This restores the original cosmology of the Great Mother at a new level of understanding.
Well, I think it hasn't quite got there yet because people haven't put 2 and 2 together. But this is the beginning, and Nassim Haramein is actually lecturing at this moment, I think, in Geneva. He's moved to Geneva from America.
Yes, from California. He was a neighbor of a friend
Yes,
of mine, and
was he?
they used to surf together. And she said Nassim has moved.
Yeah, he's moved
Yeah.
to near Geneva,
Yes.
and
Yes.
he's holding. He's invited people. I just got an invitation today to join a sort of meeting there to listen to his latest discoveries, which obviously I can't go to, which is a shame. But anyway, he's putting out his work, and he, together with Jude Currivan, Dr. Jude Currivan, who's a cosmologist, between the two of them, they are changing the way we think about the world that we're in. They're changing the way that consciousness is seen as the ground of being, and our consciousness is a tiny fractional part of that ground of being, that ground state, so to speak, which, according to the Gnostics, is made of light and love, those two things, light and love. So this is what we are made of. And this is coming through with quantum physics, that you can't separate what's out there from what's in here. We are part of something so immensely, unbelievably huge, enormous, incomprehensibly huge. But nevertheless, we're an important part because we are part of the structure of life. We're not a separate part on this little planet. We are part of the whole. And I think this is exciting and interesting, and it gives us a purpose for being here, not just getting and spending and whatever, going after celebrities and developing extraordinary things like Bezos and whatever his name is, did Facebook.
Zuckerberg,
But,
Musk.
but
Yeah.
yeah, and having a deeper relationship with what we are and what is around us, because we can't separate what is around us from what we are. We're part of nature, and we always have been. And this is what the Gnostics knew, and what the Christians forgot. That was the huge difference between the Gnostics and the Christians, that the Gnostics were close to nature, and they really entered into the soul of nature with humility and love, really, whereas the Christians turned their back on nature because they were frightened of it and looked down on anything to do with the natural world, with sexuality. To the Gnostics, sexuality was something sacred. To the Christians, it was something sinful. And that dreadful myth of the fall had a terrible effect on the relationship between men and women, and the way women were treated, the way the priesthood treated women. Absolutely unbelievably awful history of what came in with that myth of the fall.
Yes. Yes. I wanted to ask you, Anne, if you had some suggestions for our listeners and viewers, how do we, this will sound like an odd question, I guess, but not really. How do we bring back the divine feminine in our own sort of daily practice, if you will, deepening our experience of being human? I know that's something you have not only thought about, but practiced for so many years.
Yeah. I think that one of the most important things is silence, to listen, not always to be rushing around doing things, spending all your time on Facebook or WhatsApp, but actually having time in your life to do nothing at all and just to sit and reflect about things, reflect about who you are. Why have you come into this life? What are your gifts that you can give to this life? What are the relationships you could create with people which are based on love and not on rivalry or ambition or fame or whatever? These are all spurious focuses which have been given to us in our present culture, materialist culture, because there's nothing else. People have completely forgotten the need to go deep into themselves and deep into nature, spending a lot of time in nature. From childhood on, children should be taken into the woods and touch flowers, touch leaves, touch trees, know the difference, to feel the difference between bark on different trees, all that sort of thing. Become much more sensitive and intuitive to what's around them. And if you start with children like that, they will grow up having that same kind of instinct for looking beneath things or connecting things together. And then when you get up older and into adolescence, they can find things to do which develop their talents. And how can they serve this life that we're in? What can they give with the talents they're born with to other people, or to nature, or to the animals, or to the host of heaven? Some people are psychic, they can develop those abilities. Some people are very good, like my grandson, with the earth. He works with a digger, making things better and easier, creating better spaces. So he's happy doing that. He also looks after cows,
Mm.
So he sees them being born, and then he sees them growing up. He learns a huge amount just from experiencing what's happening around him. And that's what children need. They don't need all this book knowledge. They don't need all these exams to pass. They need something which connects them to the life around them, which then can grow in them until it can flower in some form, late adolescence and early manhood or womanhood, into some form of work, of creative work. And this is so essential because we put all the emphasis on the intellect and none whatsoever on the heart. And I think I talk a lot about moving from the head to the heart, listening to what the feelings are saying to us, feelings of unhappiness, of distress, depression. That comes from the soul, and the heart is the conduit to the soul. If the soul is unhappy, the person is going to feel depressed and say, I don't know why I'm depressed. I better go and get some antidepressants. And I don't know how many thousand people are on antidepressants in this country, including children, because people haven't the slightest idea that what these children and young people need is to be reconnected to nature and have something to do with their hands and their eyes and their heart, which gives them a feeling of being good to be alive. I'm happy because I'm touching things that interest me, doing things that interest me. You know, I feel so sad about the educational system and so sad about all these multitudes of people with depression. But I know from my own life that depression comes from ignoring the soul. And that's what I was doing when I was in my 20s. I hadn't got a clue about anything. And I was just thinking that, I don't know what, boyfriends, mostly.
Well,
Boyfriend's a very important part of everything. But that actually, through boyfriends, I got myself to the Far East, to that marvelous trip with collecting works of art from all the museums of the Eastern countries. That was through an Indian boyfriend. The whole thing opened up because of that. So, you know, there are things that come to life, come to us, but we don't recognize what they are because we're too young or too besotted with the boyfriend or whatever to really listen to what's happening to us and
yes,
to pay attention. And then when sorrows come, like the loss of a child or the loss of a parent, to know that there is no death is the greatest comfort because we know that we will see them again. They're not gone forever. And the material body is only part of what we are, tiniest part. We need the material body to manifest on this planet, but we don't need it afterwards, and we move into a different sort of body. So people could be comforted by the realization that there is no death for the soul and the spirit. We go on. We are immortal beings. And this great philosopher called Parmenides said, we are divine beings having a human experience. And
yes,
I think somebody else, Teilhard de Chardin, said the same thing.
yes. It's such a beautiful aphorism. Well, you just gave us a whole number of strategies. Again, I don't love that word, but about how we can perhaps cultivate a deeper sense of what it means to be human in this very strange time.
It
You know,
is it's a time of tremendous challenge and tremendous danger because we could be taken over by people who want to control us and who want to control the whole world and who have a nice little picture of how beautiful it would be if there were fewer people on the planet and they could be in charge of the rest of the remnant, so to speak. So we have to beware there are dangers, just like the Gnostics said, there are archons around, and we have certainly archons present in the WEF, and I would say the WHO, which is not what it says it is at all. It's utterly corrupt. And we need to know these things. And we need to have followed what happened in COVID and the lies that were told to us and the creation of fear that would force us to do what governments wanted us to do. But governments didn't know what they were doing. And it's all coming out now in inquiries and things.
it
And the
is.
great wrong was done and terrible loss of life through stupidity and arrogance, those two things, stupidity and arrogance. So we have to be aware, follow the money, as we've always said, where is the greatest wealth in the world, who's got control of it, and what are they doing with it, and look at the medical profession and how corrupt it's been by these how it's been corrupted by these vaccinations, which are not vaccinations at all. They're bioweapons, really, and people are now dying as a result of them. And I'm putting this 2 chapters in my book on evil, and I will put the history of what's behind COVID and the planning to reduce the population of the planet. And I'm going to put that into the book as well, because I want a record of it. Because this is all about the restoration of the feminine. It's the restoration of truth and justice. And this is what we've lost, as well as beauty and harmony. Those things that were so valued by the Gnostics, and these need to be brought back, because we have no beauty and no harmony in our life today. When we look around at the world, it's all about the struggle for power between different nations and different groups. And there's nothing to give young people a vision of what life could be and what it once was, really. It was a long time ago, way back in the Neolithic. It was much better than it is now. So I hope I haven't said too much. I usually say a lot more than I intend to say.
No, not
But
at all.
you draw
Well,
me out.
and just to be clear, the WEF, the World Economic Forum,
Yes.
the World Health Organization, so called, and I appreciate you pointing out that perhaps that WHO is misnamed or misacronymed, I suppose. Do you, maybe last question for you, Anne, I want to be respectful of your time. Do you think much about what is often called the transhumanist impulse?
The agenda, the
Yeah, this
transhumanist
idea that
agenda.
that humans should merge ever more tightly with our machines to optimize the species, transhuman.
That's the archons again, Rob.
And can you
Taking some
say,
of
can you just
what?
describe briefly the archons, and then we'll
Well, the archons, according to the Gnostics, were beings that were neither human nor extraterrestrial. They were sort of in between. They were like an aborted fetus that has grown into a fully formed being. And their aim is really not to exactly destroy the planet, but to put humanity on the wrong path so that it loses its evolutionary path and it no longer knows what it's doing, which is what we have now. It's just here in a mass on the planet, so to speak, without having any sense of direction or relationship with anything beyond itself. And the danger then is that we get the idea that we're not good enough, and that comes straight from the myth of the fall. We're sinful, we're bad. And the next stage is we're not intelligent enough. If we were more intelligent, everything would be fine. Therefore, we can enhance our intelligence with AI. Therefore, we can get control of things much more. Look, mark the word control. Wherever that is, there's the archons.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And this is, again, this is the archons is a Gnostic, part of the Gnostic um, uh, paradigm.
Yeah, for the framework of Gnostic thinking, that was part of it. And
Yeah.
they could see, they thought that the way Christianity was starting out was not good at all, because having the only Son of God was a disastrous inflation, because it meant that everybody else had no Son of God. Only the Christians had the Son of God. That meant that the other groups, whoever they were inferior.
Yeah.
And whereupon the Christians started to persecute all the other groups and try and convert them to the true religion. Fatal mistake, with terrible loss of life, terrible suffering, terrible killing went on, not only in Europe, but in Central and South America, when the conquistadors went there, bringing with them the message of Christ, so to speak. Nothing to do with love, but all to do with power. And the Christian message was lost. And the Gnostics could see this. They could see the inflation of the idea to have the only Son of God was a mistake, because we're all sons and daughters of God, they would have said.
That's right. And I've come to think of the Gnostics in what is now Europe, or Greater Europe, let's say, as the indigenous spiritual humans of that continent, in the same way that you can see, the suffering of indigenous peoples elsewhere at the hands of this excess.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I think Lash says this, goes into it quite deeply, saying that they were the inheritors of the Paleolithic and Neolithic consciousness, which was shamanic. And the shamanic consciousness was lost when you had the priesthoods, because the priesthoods did not like the idea of shamans interpreting reality and getting in the way of what they were saying. God was saying this, that, and the other. You've got to behave in this way if you want to get to heaven. or if you want to have God look after you, you've got to behave in a certain way. The shamans wouldn't have said that. They would have said, listen to God, listen to nature, listen to the trees. They will teach you what you need to know. So a totally different cosmology or concept of reality came in when the priesthoods came in. And that even in Egypt, you see the change between the old priesthood, which Plato went to learn, and Pythagoras both went to Egypt to learn from the priests there. And their knowledge was based on the Egyptian knowledge. But later, the Egyptian priesthood became corrupt and no longer were teaching this great teaching that they passed on to Plato and Pythagoras, particularly Pythagoras. So,
please, yeah.
No, I was just going to say there's just so much we could go on talking for hours. But
I know. Yeah, we'll end it here, hoping that we'll do this again soon. Do you have an anticipated? I hate asking authors this.
No.
Okay, time for your book. Okay, I'm so excited.
I did have the end of May, but I've got held up by certain things in my own personal life, the illness of my husband and my daughters with problems with her business. So I've been distracted. So I would say it'll probably be more like July.
Well, we cannot wait, and we look forward to reading it, of course, and sharing it and having another conversation with you. Anne Baring, the article is Our Crucial Time of Choice. Again, your website, annebaring.com, your beautiful books and so much incredible wisdom. Thank you so much for being with us on the Three Brothers Quest. Wishing you well. And of course, special thanks to our sponsors at the Marion Institute and Michael and Philip and Ian Baldwin. Anne Baring, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's been a delight talking.
And you. Welcome to the great requesting room. We are here with the Baldwins to reflect on Anne Baring and our second conversation. Our first, of course, was about this book, The Dream of the Cosmos. And we had a chance to talk with Anne about the divine feminine and some of her more recent projects. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good to see everybody. So what did you make of our second conversation with Anne Baring across the pond?
Well, to kick it off, she's just absolutely remarkable. I mean, it's extraordinary. And thank heavens we captured her again, knowing her age, but you would hardly believe she was that age of 92. I think for me, because I think the thing that I care so much about in this quest is this question around the root causes of cruelty throughout the world and for the millennia. And we've come up with 4 of them that I think we're fairly in accord about in the way of root causes. And at least for me, the biggest one is this gender imbalance. And if you let these male traits, all of which are of course important and valid, go unchecked by the lack of feminine balance, you get, and I think we all agree, you get the greed, you get the manipulation, you get the domination, you get all of the control issues. And she brought up that word control with a certain amount of emphasis. And what I think is just so abundantly apparent in that discussion is the way she nails the whole thing. She nails the whole imbalance. And I think it's extraordinary the way she can, take you back to Neolithic, Paleolithic, all that ancient time of balance in the shamanic tradition of those cultures. And then how starting in 2000 BC, it started to disintegrate to some degree, culminating with the Deuteronomists in, I think it's 623 BC, who then just totally trashed the whole goddess image the whole sort of nature connection, etc. And then it's that whole devolution thereafter that is just so abundantly clear from my point of view, the way she puts it in historical perspective ever since. So for me, that's a major. I don't know where else you need to go to make that as clear as Anne makes it. There's my intro.
Good.
Yeah, when I listened to your second interview, Rob, which we're talking about with her, we used to call this discipline that we're engaged in metahistory, meaning overarching, going underneath and way back. And when history all by itself, let's say you're a historian of early America, it takes a long time to master the details. But if you encompass 15,000 years plus, that takes a very long time. And you have to plow the field multiple times or listen to others who have plowed it. So for me, I concur with Michael. Things that I'd ruminated about and read about for decades started to come into clearer focus. And one of the focuses, as Michael says, the third millennium BC, when the Babylonians put forward, and we read that, all of us read this, whether we remember it or not, about the Sumerian or Babylonian, I've forgotten which, the Babylonians being slightly later and more, but it's the end of Sumerian civilization where you get the great song of Marduk gutting and slaughtering the Mat, or the great goddess, and the rage that is encompassed in those ancient verses was startling to read. And I don't think any of us can say, well, there's a rational interpretation. It was an epical swing away from the goddess. And so she talks not so much about that song, that hymn, but she talks about that time. Curiously, that time was when Abram, the son of the high priest of one of the I think it was, of one of the Sumerian city-states, leaves as Sumer is being destroyed as a civilization and goes into his great exodus to the west, into southern Turkey, Ebril, I think, and then, of course, into what is now Israel, or Jordan and Israel. And you have the beginning of the what I would call the historical Old Testament. So that's an interesting coincidence. She doesn't dwell on that, and we won't here. But then fast forward 1,400 years or so, and you get the Deuteronomists. And I didn't realize until Anne how revolutionary those buggers were.
Yeah.
They as Michael said, they wrote out the God. They extirpated olive groves, which were considered sacred sites. They literally removed. So I believe that, and then it follows up another 1,000 years later, a millennium later, when we get to the 4th century AD, and we get to all that happened in that century, which she covers. So this time it rang a bell.
Yeah.
What were the forces? They weren't just individual. They weren't, here's my beeper, just let me shut it up. Anyway, so they weren't just, they were epical.
Yeah.
Those forces, they were epical.
Very good.
And she does a masterful job.
Yeah.
And it's such a pleasure to see her in her
I know it.
red and blue, and you know, she's
Beautifully coiffed hair.
yeah.
She's remarkable.
All right, I'll excuse myself for 1 second.
Yeah. I was just reminded quickly of her first talk, where she presented the slides and her brilliant analysis of that shift from what she calls the lunar to the solar,
Yeah.
the great feminine, the lunar to the great masculine, let's say, the solar. Yeah. Philip, do you want to weigh in?
Well, I think everything that both Michael and Ian have said is spot on. I don't really have much to add to that. I would have said many of the things that Ian just said, because these epical moments, of which there are dozens, leading up to understanding where we are today. But what's elusive is why they happen. What drove the Song of Marduk and all that slaughter? What drove the Deuteronomists? What drove the Christians to transform themselves into this apparently loving nature of Jesus and so on, into a totalitarian state religion? What drove these behaviors with their very, as Ian said, very marked moments in time? And all of the people we've interviewed and go on interviewing, we get down to many of these issues of these changes. And why have they happened to us? Now, Anne alludes to this in referencing the archons. In spite of many years of interaction with John Lash, who I would guess would be fair to say is the most articulate thinker as concerns the archon phenomenon, I have to admit that I don't really get it about the archons.
No.
And this is also linked in with Rudolf Steiner, who's very much into the archons, which is, I believe, Michael and Ian will correct me, but I believe that implicit in the archons is very much the notion of good and evil, a concept that I personally have a lot of trouble with. I think it's a choice and it's within all of us. That doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have good and evil as external concepts, but I've always found it somehow simplistic. Be that as it may, why have we taken this road, all these steps, the whole Christian transformation, the takeover, which Anne dwells on also, about Constantine and Theodopoulos, the emperor who succeeded.
Theodosius, yeah.
Thank you, Ian. Theodosius,
The
the
first.
emperor who succeeded him. You know, that was a striking moment of change. It precipitated the way modern science works in some ways. Anyway, enough. Those are some reflections that turn in my head as we address these subjects.
Philip, I do think that the critical thing is what you're saying, and Ian is saying too, about these moments, these sort of mysterious almost. I mean, how could it be that suddenly the Deuteronomists do this vast sweep of destruction of the feminine, and then, or Marduk or whatever, But once that's in place, the domination rolls forward in ever, I would say, almost accelerating force. So that when you get to Constantine, or you get to Theodosius, or you get to the purging of everybody. I mean, that's just the outcome of what's triggered, starting with the Deuteronomists or whatever, the destruction of Sumer. I mean, I just want to. I think that's important. It isn't sort of a mystery anymore. The way the trigger is the mystery.
Well, we got to keep in mind that there are huge intervals. So, to pick a little bit of an not random, a little bit of a arbitrary date, 2000 BC, 2 millennia before Christ, and the current AD period we're in. Between there and the Deuteronomists is 1400 years.
Yeah.
And we don't have I think very few people have a grasp of all that went on in those 1400. We have Schlien, how do you spell him? The alphabet guy, Michael.
Schlien.
Leonard Schlien.
Yeah, Leonard Schlien. So we have him logging in. We have a lot of people logging in, but if you forced me to the wall and said what exactly happened in those 1400 years, I would cough up not a hell of a lot. And then you go from 600, hold on, Philip, 600 to the 4th century. So that's another 900, 1,000 years, which a lot more is known even by us about what went on in that period. Now, we should keep track of what Philip raised, which is the problem of good and evil, which I took him to say he doesn't really resonate with it. But it involves, and Lash was the one who brought this to our attention, and it's one of the most valuable things for me that Lash did in his book and in his conversations with us, which was, how do the archons operate? And as Anne herself said, they're shadowy beings, and they belong in the solar system, according to the Gnostics. They belong in the solar. They inhabit what we might call inorganic realms. That is, they're not really comfortable here amongst us embedded biological beings, but they're envious of us for some reason. And the demiurge is envious of Gaia creation. He's an inorganic, out of control God, if you will. But the key thing that Lash pointed out, that the archons, at least the pagan archons, believed, was that evil is achieved through choice. We make choices, we assess things incorrectly from a Gaian perspective. And those choices get to be incremental. So we take a step, and instead of saying, whoa, that's the wrong direction, let's pull back, we don't pull back. We take the next step. And then we end up with someone like Francis Bacon plotting the future steps, and we end up where we are today. So anyway, that's one thing. Anne didn't truly explore that, I think, but I think she's fully aware of it.
Yeah.
And it's a subtle business.
Ian, I had tried to stop you just to ask you to explain for anyone who's listening the work of Leonard Shlain relative to language. Or perhaps Michael would do that.
Michael would be better.
Well, Leonard Shlain, to the best of my recollection of his very important book, really, I think, is pointing out that the invention of language is a very pivotal influence on behavior. The choice of the way in which we constructed words, independent and together, dictated a way of being that is reflected, I think, in everything, that we're talking about, that Anne is talking about, in the way of an inevitable, I would guess to say, devolution of behavior. So it had a very influential influence on who we were, who we are.
Did Shlain, when he talks about language, I think we've had language for tens of millennia. He means the writing, doesn't he?
Yeah, I thought it was about writing.
Yeah.
Writing.
Yeah.
Putting it on paper.
Yeah.
Shlain's no longer with us, correct?
No. Unfortunately, we all really, I ought to find the incredible, I think it was a TED talk, I'm not quite sure, but he did a magnificent presentation back in, like, I think 2005, and he died a year or two later, that I must find to share, but that's not for here.
Please.
Well, actually, that would be an important thing to do.
I'll find it.
Good.
Yeah, and his book that Michael and Philip, you both recommended when we were all together in Marion, is rising to the top of my pile.
Yeah, good. The Alphabet and the Goddess. The Alphabet
and the Goddess, I think, is right. Yeah.
Yes, I'm really excited to delve into that. Well, we're almost at time here. We want to be respectful of our time. But any last thoughts about Anne Baring in our second conversation with her?
The only thing I would add, the only thing I thought was very meaningful, and so I didn't really expect it when you asked for suggestions of what we might all do, Rob. God, how I love, she said, silence. Try a little silence.
It's not our forte.
It's not our forte. Well, it's not our podcasts. I just thought it was such a brilliant suggestion, indicating reflection, indicating an opportunity to sort of open up quietly to a greater understanding, instead of charging around and yakety-yakking and on the devices and all of the craziness that we get up to get through a day. So I love that. I thought that was just so wise.
Yeah, and I have to say that I loved her trashing formal education and getting the children out in nature and doing things with their hands, and her whole riff about the children was a breath of fresh air.
There's a book I read recently by, I think his name is Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I.
Oh yeah, he's #1 on the bestseller.
Okay, so the best part of that book, which is called The Anxious Generation, and which talks about the advent of the iPhone and what it did, and because it did the opposite. There you go. It did the exact opposite of silence, and it is having a revolutionary effect on what is called Generation Z, but all of us, but especially Generation Z, our grandchildren, Michael, and soon Philip. So in that talk, there's a section of the book 2/3 the way in on the spiritual antidote. And one of the things he talks about is not only playing, but sitting in silence and just encountering yourself, encountering the world. So, yeah.
I just add, because it was so recent, quarterly I talked to the head of the Waldorf Schools International on behalf of a client of ours. And I did it last week. And she's extraordinary woman. And of course, it's Rudolf Steiner, as everybody knows, created the Waldorf schools. And we normally talk about, well, we're in Ukraine, we have to fund a bomb shelter because they can't have a school without a bomb shelter, or we're in Kenya, or we're in Chile. I mean, all the problematical countries where Waldorf education exists or is being rubbed out, like in China and frankly, Great Britain. But this time, only one thing she wanted to talk about, which was the desperate need for kindergarten Waldorf teachers, because what she's observing is exactly what we're all involved, interested in, which is these children are being shut down at 3 years of age and 4 years of age because they don't do anything but be hypnotized in front of laptops and TVs and cell phones. And it is literally impacting their brain. And if we don't get them into Waldorf schools to generate creativity and play and interaction with nature, we are screwed.
Talk about cruelty.
Yeah, right.
That's it. That's as cruel as you're going to get,
Yeah.
in my opinion. Anyway, time has come, Rob.
It has, but just a thought. I wonder if perhaps we might consider inviting Jonathan Haidt onto our platform. I myself have read both of his most recent books, The Coddling of the American Mind, which is outstanding, with Greg Lukianoff, his fellow researcher, and then his brand new one, The Anxious Generation, which Ian mentioned. Anyway, well, gentlemen, we have some very exciting guests coming up. We won't tip our hand here, but for our listeners and viewers, stay tuned, and appreciate you all. It's so good to be in the requesting room with you. And until next time, thanks to the Marion Institute, to the three of you, and on we flow.